Welcome everyone to the first episode of Nobody's Favourite Movie. I thought I'd kick off this inaugural podcast with a discussion of something that was topical at the time I first conceived of this podcast, but isn't so much anymore, and that is the 2022 Sight and Sound list of the top 100 greatest films of all time. Now, you may recall that there was a bit of an online uproar, a bit of controversy when they revealed the poll results for the critics' top 100 list that they've been doing every 10 years since, I think, 1952. Some people weren't happy about a few of the placements on this list, most notably the number one spot, which is occupied by Chantal Akerman's Jeanne Dielman. One of the reactions that I remember seeing at the time, and one that I think is illustrative of how ridiculous the reaction to this list was actually from Paul Schrader, the filmmaker Paul Schrader, who I believe posted this on Facebook, actually. And so I'm just going to read what he wrote. He wrote, "The sudden appearance of Jeanne Dielman in the number one slot undermines the Sight and Sound poll's credibility. This year's Sight and Sound poll reflects not a historical continuum, but a politically correct rejiggering. Ackerman's film is a favourite of mine, but its unexpected number one rating does it no favours. Jeanne Dielman will from this time forward be remembered not only as an important film in cinema history, but also as a landmark of distorted, woke reappraisal." Now, this to me is incredibly idiotic because the thing is, this list is a poll, right? So even if we admit that all of those people, all of those critics who listed Jeanne Dielman in their top 10 did so for woke political reasons, would this not also be an authentic reflection of a particular historical continuum, as he puts it? Why would a woke reappraisal of a film be any different from any other critical reappraisal of a film in indicating to us the peculiarities of the tastes and beliefs and aesthetic priorities of a particular time in history, a particular time in the history of film criticism? Because obviously that's really the whole point of these lists, right? There's no objective top 100 greatest films of all time list. There is, however, a sense of what people in a given time and place perceive to be the greatest films, the most noteworthy films of all time. This, of course, is the whole notion, the whole point of the idea of a canon. So that's what this list tells us. It tells us that at this point in time, a lot of people value this specific aspect of film. So obviously I think it's a massive waste of time to care too much or get too mad about which movies land where on a list like this. It's nothing to lose sleep over, but the general reaction to lists like this, and indeed the very fact that lists like this exist in the first place, does, to me at least, raise interesting questions about how we construct and collectively agree to a canon of films, or a canon of works in any medium, really. Because I'm sure I'm not the only one who, when I was first getting into film, like really getting into it, I would look up these lists, the lists of the classics, the greatest films of all time, and I'm sure at some point I even came across one of Sight and Sound's lists. And over the years, over time, you become exposed to particular films, the titles of particular films. You might not even watch them, but as you see them pop up again and again in these lists and in discussions, you begin to kind of internalize a canon, a perception of the greatest films of all time. I think for me, even more than lists like this, it was looking up what the favorite films of my favorite directors were. And you would see the same films and the same filmmakers popping up again and again, your Tarkovskys, your Bergmans, your Antonionis, all that good stuff. Your Kurosawas, Ozus, whatever. And so these lists, they become something that you kind of take for granted as being the best movies ever made, or at least as being representative of the movies that many people seem to agree are the best movies ever made, even if you don't. But to me, this raises a problem, a concern, because viewing a medium only through these kinds of canons often leaves us in the curious and arguably unnatural circumstance of only being exposed to the greatest works in the medium and remaining blind to the endless heaps of mediocrity out of which emerge those classics, those masterpieces. So the question is, can the true quality and significance of these movies really be appreciated without an understanding of their specific context in film history? Or does their status as masterpieces actually have something to do with those lesser movies from which they, the classics, distinguish themselves? Because if what makes a great work of art great does actually have something to do with that mountain of mediocrity, that mountain of lesser works from which the great works distinguish themselves, then what chance do we really have of properly, truly understanding those classics if we do not, in turn, investigate mediocrity, if we do not take a look at those other films? So my goal here is to compose a kind of anti-canon. I'll be doing a series of podcasts exploring that mountain of mediocrity, all those lackluster movies nobody ever really talks about that would never show up on a Sight and Sound poll, but which surely, if only precisely because of how mediocre they are in comparison, can give us a clearer picture of a particular time and place in film history, which will in turn help us better understand why the classics are classics, why they stand out. And so hopefully this podcast will be a good opportunity to discover some lesser known films, which, who knows, we might even end up actually enjoying and liking, but also be an opportunity to rediscover those masterpieces that we thought we knew so well. Now, it just so happens, and this is a good segue into the topic of this first episode, it just so happens that the other day I was reading this interview from one of my favourite filmmakers of all time, Jacques Rivette, and in this interview he actually addresses some of these concerns, some of these ideas that I've just brought up. In this interview he's talking about this book by the French writer and, I suppose, literary theorist, critic, Jean Paulhan. And the book is called A Short Preface to All Criticism. And this is what Rivette says about this book. A Short Preface to All Criticism is Paulhan's fundamental book on the subject, except that he asks the question but doesn't answer it. How is it that we speak of a particular work because we think it's important, and how is it that we know that all the others, full of good things they may be, aren't of any importance whatsoever? That's the most important point. It's what comes first. We can comment all we want after this, but why do we speak of this work and not that work? Why is it that even those who find a work terrible pick this one out for consideration and not those around it? How is it that such and such painting, book, music, or film exists, that they have an existence as a painting, as a novel, as a poem, as a film? That's the fundamental question that everyone dodges. For Baudelaire's contemporaries, why was it soon evident that Baudelaire was someone to fight over and that others weren't? Why is it that critics, and not just critics but also amateurs interested in literature, choose to discuss, heap praise on, and severely criticize such and such work and pass over all others in silence? And Paulhan cites the example of books which, at their time, were badly received, but people agreed right away that they were exactly the books to be badmouthed, whereas no one disputed the merit of many other works. On the contrary, everyone agreed that they were beautifully written, wholly pleasant to read, and then completely forgotten 6 months later. So that was Jacques Rivette, and many of you may know that Jacques Rivette was one of the founding members of what we refer to as the French New Wave. And Rivette, along with other French New Wave filmmakers such as Godard, Truffaut, Romer, they all got their start in the industry writing for Les Cahiers du Cinéma. And today I want to talk about an article that was originally published in Les Cahiers du Cinéma and written by one of Rivette's fellow French New Wave mavericks, and that was François Truffaut. And that article is called A Certain Tendency of French Cinema, and it was published in 1954. And in this article, Truffaut talks about a particular period of French cinema, a particular tendency of French cinema, that he refers to as the tradition of quality. And if the premise of this episode is correct, you probably haven't heard of the tradition of quality or of any of the films from this period, which is the immediate post-war years of French cinema. And it seems that in this case, history sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it? Because if we take a quick look at that sight and sound list, I can count at least a dozen French New Wave films, and not a single film from this alleged tradition of quality. Now, of course, these kinds of canons, as we said, speak nothing to the absolute quality of these films, but it's certainly clear to see that these movies that Truffaut addresses in this article, these acclaimed movies at the time, have not really stood the test of time and have all but virtually disappeared from the collective consciousness of critics and cinephiles and other filmmakers as well. So I want to investigate why that might be. Why does no one really talk about the films of Jean Delannoy, Claude Autant-Lara, or Yves Allégret? Was Truffaut's assessment of this particular period of French cinema correct? So in this first episode, we're going to be focusing not on one particular movie, but rather a particular time and place in film history. And we'll be comparing these films not only with the other French films that Truffaut and co. did actually like and praise from this same period, but also with the films Truffaut and the other Cahiers critics would go on to make themselves, to see how their style can be seen as a radical departure from the general trend of post-war French cinema that immediately preceded them. So let's have a look at this article and what Truffaut is actually talking about. So immediately we see an echo with that Rivette interview I just quoted from. Truffaut writes, "Although the French cinema is represented by 100 or so films per year, it goes without saying that a mere 10 to 12 of them deserve to attract the attention of critics and cinephiles." So this notion of most of what comes out being mediocre and not really worthy of attention, that's kind of what Rivette was talking about as well. And it's interesting because we can make a sort of distinction here, because Truffaut is singling out a particular tradition of French cinema here, and he's actually saying that these movies, that, as we'll see, he doesn't like and he considers to be kind of representative of a sort of mediocrity, these movies are still worth talking about. And presumably there are plenty, I guess about 90 or so French films that aren't worth talking about. But the reason why these films are worth talking about is because of their particular kind of mediocrity and because of the way they're being received at the time. So there's a difference between mediocre films that are worthy of criticism and bad or mediocre films that are unworthy of criticism. So Truffaut then starts off by sort of detailing a short history of French cinema up until that point. And he says that early French sound cinema, the talkies, were a carbon copy of American cinema. He compares, for example, Pepe Le Moko to Scarface. But then, developments in script writing led to the emergence of what we call poetic realism. And the developments in script writing are mostly down to Jacques Prévert's influence. He would write the scripts for most of these films that we associate with the poetic realism movement. So this is in the 30s, leading into the Second World War, and Truffaut calls Le Quai des Brumes, aka Court of Shadows, directed by Marcel Carné. He calls it the masterpiece of the so-called poetic realism school. And the characteristics of this particular period of French cinema are the sort of cynical and kind of darker themes, and the focus on usually on working class heroes, protagonists, generally portrayed by Jean Gabin. And then you add to that Jacques Prévert's sort of poetic flair, and you get poetic realism. But finally, Truffaut says, the war and post-war years led to the development of psychological realism. And he names the leading directors of this movement, psychological realism, as Claude Autant-Lara, Jean Delannoy, René Clément, Yves Allégret, and Marcello Pagliaro. Now, to distinguish psychological realism and poetic realism, whereas poetic realism did appear as a kind of fully formed, very distinct style compared to the French cinema that preceded it, psychological realism definitely appears as a kind of slight mutation of poetic realism. So it's very similar stylistically and narratively, but as the name suggests, here, rather than the kind of social, political, class critiques of the poetic realism films, now things are reduced to the psychological states, the inner turmoil of the characters. It's much more down to the tragic desires of the characters. But the main difference between poetic realism and psychological realism lies within the scripts. So we said that poetic realism was really defined by Jacques Prévert's influence, and according to Truffaut, psychological realism is defined by the influence of two scriptwriters in particular, and they are Jean Orange and Pierre Bost. Now, at this point it's worth noting that many of the films associated with what we call poetic realism have actually survived in the collective cinephile consciousness, notably the films of Marcel Carné, whereas the films of psychological realism have not, which does in a way sort of give credence to Truffaut's criticisms. And just to be clear, psychological realism is what Truffaut is calling the tradition of quality. The term psychological realism is more a description of, the actual style and subject matter and narrative style of those films, whereas the appellation tradition of quality is more of a kind of snarky framing of how these films are being received at the time Truffaut is writing this article. So let's talk about these two rapscallions, these two scriptwriters, Jean Orange and Pierre Bost. So according to Truffaut, they approached their work with a different understanding of the limits of adaptation. And that's really the key to this whole critique here. Adaptation and how films should handle the process of adaptation and what it tells us about the medium of film. So Truffaut writes that they challenged the notion of what was generally meant by adaptation. In other words, they are said to have replaced the old prejudice that required one to be faithful to the letter by the opposite requirement to be faithful to the spirit, to the point where the following audacious aphorism was coined: an honest adaptation is a betrayal. And he goes on to say that the touchstone of adaptation as practiced by Orange and Bost is the so-called process of equivalence. This process takes for granted that in the novel being adapted, there are filmable and unfilmable scenes, and that instead of scrapping the latter, as used to be done, you had to think up equivalent scenes, in other words, ones that the author of the novel might have written for the screen. Inventing without betraying is the watchword that Orange and Bost liked to cite, forgetting that one can also betray by omission. So Truffaut questions this kind of arbitrary process, this practice of deciding which scenes are filmable and which are unfilmable. And he says that surely, it depends on the abilities of the director. And he goes on to compare two different adaptations of the same novel by Georges Bernanos, and that novel is Diary of a Country Priest, which was, of course, famously adapted by Bresson in, I think, 1950-51. But this novel was also adapted into a screenplay by Orange and Bost, although that screenplay was never actually produced. But Truffaut has evidently read this screenplay, and he compares two scenes from the novel and the script to sort of give us an idea of the priorities, the narrative priorities of these two writers. So he writes that in the middle of the novel there is a discussion about faith between the priest and an obtuse atheist called Arsène. The discussion ends with Arsène saying, "When one is dead, everything is dead." And in the adaptation, the script adaptation that was never produced, that is, the discussion, which takes place on the very grave of that priest and is between Arsène and a different priest, brings the film to a close. The line, "When one is dead, everything is dead," was to be the last line of dialogue in the film, one that carries weight, the only one perhaps that the audience will remember. But in the book, Bernanos did not conclude with "When one is dead, everything is dead," but with the line, "What difference does that make? Everything is grace." End quote. So, obviously there's a major difference thematically between the idea "when one is dead, everything is dead" and the line "everything is grace." So here Truffaut identifies certain tendencies in Orange and Bost's writing, notably their anti-clerical sentiment, their propensity for blasphemy and profanation, and their dialogue full of double entendres. And he says that these propensities affect their ability to faithfully adapt the source material, because, according to him, under the cloak of literature and, of course, quality, audiences are served up their usual helping of gloom, nonconformism, and facile audacity. So these are the biases that Truffaut thinks these scriptwriters are sort of mixing into their work, and is one of the reasons why they sort of betray the source material they're adapting. But this passage is also of interest to me because he makes the comparison with Bresson, who is obviously a filmmaker he holds in high regard, and so it establishes that there is a sort of parallel French cinema happening during this period, aside from the tradition of quality. But it's a parallel cinema where each filmmaker is kind of creating their own style, their own individuality, and it can't really be categorized in the same way that the films of the tradition of quality can be, where there are strong family resemblances between all of these films. And later in the article, Truffaut actually names a few of these other directors. So he says there's Renoir, Bresson, Jean Cocteau, Jacques Becker, Abel Gance, Max Ophuls, Jacques Tati, and Roger Linhart. And so it's interesting that all of these, with the exception maybe of Roger Linhart, who I had never actually heard of before reading this article, all of these are still remembered and revered to this day. It's probably worth thinking about how much of this canon, this remembrance of the films of this period, is really down to the quality of these particular films and filmmakers, and how much of it is down to the importance of the voices of the critics at Les Cahiers du Cinéma and the French New Wave filmmakers, and how they constructed a particular canon of French cinema that would then get passed down through the generations. I mean, I would lean towards saying that, yes, actually the filmmakers that Truffaut lists here in opposition to the tradition of quality are actually superior filmmakers and do rightly deserve to be better remembered than those other filmmakers. But it is interesting to think about how these canons are formed and who are the voices shaping those canons. But Bresson is an interesting one because he is one of my favourite filmmakers, and right after this part of the article, Truffaut actually directly compares Bresson to one of the filmmakers of the tradition of quality. He writes that basically Allégret and Delannoy are no more than caricatures of Henri-Georges Clouzot and Bresson. So because of this specific comparison of Delannoy being a kind of knockoff, inferior Bresson, I had the idea of watching a Delannoy film and a Bresson film back to back, Again, to do what this podcast is all about, to get an idea of what really makes the greats stand out in context of what most of the other films of the time looked like. Because obviously Bresson's films don't look like anything else that was coming out at the time and don't really look like anything that has come out since. And so I chose films that had vaguely similar subject matter. So I went with Bresson's Diary of a Country Priest that we just talked about and Delannoy's Pastoral Symphony, which was scripted by Orange and Bost and is also an adaptation, this time of André Gide's novel, about a minister who falls in love with a blind girl that he adopts into his family, and unfortunately his son also falls for her, and the whole thing ends rather tragically. Now, when I started this little experiment of watching these films back to back, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't really sure if I was going into this, if I was really going to pick up on what Truffaut was talking about in that article, because obviously I'm not as familiar with this period of French cinema as he is. I didn't live through it like Truffaut did, so I'm not quite as in tune with the nuances and particularities of that context, which I guess is the whole point of this podcast, to get on that same wavelength. But despite this, it's surprising just how evident his main criticisms became to me almost immediately as I started watching this film. Now, whether you personally take issue with those facets of the film is a matter of taste, obviously, but there's no denying what Truffaut calls the literariness of this kind of movie. It is very, very scripty, but even beyond that, what really stood out to me was the style. There's a kind of precision to each element, to every directorial decision, which may be satisfying in the moment. It's a well put together film, but it struggles to linger longer and deeper in the mind of the viewer after the film, compared to something like Bresson's films, where the style is so specific, so unique, that it sticks with you. It kind of creates its own rhythm that you then, if you really develop a taste for it, you really want to go back to it again and again to re-experience that rhythm. But in this film, in Pastoral Symphony, and the other films of the tradition of quality, I feel like everything lacks weight, cinematic weight. Every single moment, every single line of dialogue, every character action, everything rests in the comfort of immediate utility. Everything is perfectly functional. Every visual stylistic move makes perfect sense. Everything is very solid. If you were in film school and you handed in this film, you would definitely get top marks because it's very academic. I think one of the things that bothers Truffaut about this particular period of French cinema is that kind of academicism. There doesn't really seem to be any real interest in the medium, in what film is capable of as a medium, or the underlying assumptions upon which rest the aesthetic decisions of the filmmaker, which of course are all things the French New Wave directors would be concerned with later. There's only the concern for adapting the text as competently as possible. That's it, everything's competent. And the visual devices, the cinematic techniques, they're just ingredients, they're just tools in the filmmaker's toolbox to be used to accomplish the goal of successfully and effectively adapting the screenplay. Efficiency is the key word here. It's the embodiment of competent application of technique, but with no soul, no deeper thought, and it's boring. But the important point to make is that it's not bad. None of the films I watched were bad. They were all just fine. And that's something that that's a term that you would never use to describe Bresson or Renoir or any of those other filmmakers that Truffaut mentioned. You would never come away from those films thinking, oh yeah, that was fine, that was just solid. No, either you dislike them, like many of the critics at the time did, or you would come away thinking, wow, there's nothing else out there quite like that. I'm not going to get that experience anywhere else. But the experience of the tradition of quality films is precisely that. It's an experience that you could get anywhere else. So yeah, it's just enough to be good, not so little as to be bad or unengaging, and not so much as to be great or genuinely rewarding in any way. It's just enough to be good, which also means that there's not really a good reason to strongly dislike this sort of movie, unless perhaps you're coming at the issue from a broader, more contextual angle like Truffaut and the Cahiers critics were, because obviously they had a different perspective on the cinema of the time, and they had their own goals, their own aesthetic ideals. But as a modern individual watching a random instance of a cinematic trend from 80 years ago, the only possible reaction is, that was alright, I guess. And this is kind of the point that Truffaut makes in this next passage, where he writes, "As the year 1953 comes to a close, if I had to draw up a list of the audacities of the French cinema, I would not be able to include the vomiting scene in The Proud Ones, ClaudeLedoux's refusal to pick up the holy water sprinkler in Le Bon Dieu sans confession, or the homosexual relationship between the characters in The Wages of Fear. My preference would go to Monsieur Hulot's way of walking, the maid's soliloquies in Françoise Steps Out, the mise-en-scène in The Golden Coach, the direction of actors in The Earrings of Madame de, and also Gantz's experiments with polyvision. You will have realized that these audacities are the work of men of the cinema, not scriptwriters, of directors, not men of letters." And so that's the problem with the tradition of quality, is that it was shaped by men of letters, not auteurs of the cinema. And he goes on to say that Orange and Bust are basically men of letters, and my criticism of them here is that they look down on the cinema because they undervalue it. They approach scripts the way people do when they think they can rehabilitate a delinquent by finding him or her a job. They always believe they have done all they can for a script by embellishing it with subtleties, with the art of nuance that is the tenuous merit of the modern novel. One of the major failings of those who attempt to explain what the cinema is about is that they believe they are doing it a service by using literary jargon. So Truffaut here is really taking umbrage with the idea that cinema is somehow inferior to literature, and the people who sort of condescendingly try to improve cinema by making it more literary, rather than doing what the French New Wave filmmakers would do, which is try to get at what makes cinema distinct as an art form, do things only film can do. And I just want to mention this other quote, where he says that these films resort to a form of tabula rasa, so that nothing is left on the screen except sophisticated framing, complicated lighting, and sleek photography, all of them elements that keep the tradition of quality alive. So this is another point of contention here for Truffaut, and one that isn't really emphasized enough in this article, where he focuses more on the scriptwriters and the problems of the literariness of these films. The other point is the visual style and the conformity of the films of the tradition of quality. The comment here about the sophistication of the framing, the lighting, the photography really makes me think of one of the major contributions of the French New Wave, which is that sort of lack of sophistication, specifically. I mean, if we contrast that description that he's just given with the opening scene of Truffaut's Shoot the Piano Player, for example, that tracking shot on the street through the shadows, with these characters that are barely visible, barely audible, that sort of stripped down, chaotic directorial style that feels much more refreshing, especially when you've been watching a bunch of these earlier, more, like I said, academic films. And I said earlier on that this would be an opportunity to discover these lesser known films, but also an opportunity to perhaps rediscover some of the greats. And that's kind of what I did here, because Truffaut is actually the one filmmaker of those kind of four main French New Wave guys, Godard, Rivette, Truffaut, Romer. He's the one who I'm definitely least familiar with. I mean, Rivette and Romer are definitely among my all-time favourites, and I'm a big fan of Godard's work as well, more specifically his sort of later post-80s work. But Truffaut was a filmmaker that whose filmography I never really delved into, so I thought this was a good chance to actually watch some of his classics. And I started with his first film, and one of his most well-known films, and one that I had somehow never seen before, which is The 400 Blows. And it's clear right from the get-go why Truffaut's films stand out. Like I said, especially when you spent the last few days watching these other sort of stylistically boring and repetitive movies, it certainly feels very refreshing. I think that's the best way to see it. That's the best way to describe Truffaut's style. It's just refreshing. There's a playful kind of freedom here, and obviously that's form perfectly embodying content in the case of The 400 Blows, which is all about a kid just kind of going around having fun and doing whatever he wants, trying to sort of escape the mold of society, so to speak. And there's a looseness to both the narrative structure and the cinematography here. So the narrative has that kind of slice of life, meandering feel to it. There's almost a kind of tendency toward the observation, the sort of honest, authentic observation of behavior that's reminiscent of Italian neorealism, as opposed to the concise, utilitarian conception of the tradition of quality. And it's not that Truffaut's films are full of superfluous details, but there's clearly a greater range of naturalistic detail. And it's also shot in CinemaScope, or I think it was called Daily Scope, and also entirely on location, I believe, which adds to the naturalism, obviously, and the wide frame really allows for a wider picture of the world Antoine inhabits, his place in his environment. Here we're not just seeing a soundstage, we're not just seeing the adaptation, one-to-one correspondence of the film with the script. Here we are seeing an actual world, an actual city, the actual lives of those who inhabit this world. And I can't think of a better example than that, I don't know what to call it, the spinning wheel scene at the fairground. I mean, a scene that just kind of goes on, and that has no real immediate significance to the plot. I mean, the point about Antoine not going to school and just having fun could have been done differently in a sort of montage or whatever. But here we get this scene that the camera just sits there and insists on the fun that Antoine is having. And there's a kind of magic to it. The scene exists for purely formal and sensory reasons. Firstly, obviously, it makes great use of the CinemaScope format, and it's also just pure cinematic joy. It's a celebration of movement. And obviously there would rarely be room for such a scene in a more conveniently conceived picture. And obviously the same goes for that extended running scene at the end of the film. Definitely the most cathartic scene in the whole movie. Now, before we end this discussion, I would like to return to the problem of adaptation in film, because this was a big kind of debate in film criticism at the time, in the 40s, 50s, when film was really starting to develop its own identity as a medium, or at least when a lot more people, more critics and theorists were really starting to reflexively comment on the possibilities of the medium. And we can take a look at this article by a French writer who would later become a great filmmaker in his own right and was also associated with the French New Wave, and that is Alexandre Astruc. And he wrote this article called Birth of a New Avant-Garde, the Camera Pen or Camera Stylo. And in this article, he talks about what distinguishes cinema and how cinema is really starting to become its own language. And this is very, very important in the context of these debates around adaptation and the idea that film just becomes this sort of one-to-one translation of a pre-existing literary text. It's kind of subordinated to that literature. So here Astruc writes that cinema is quite simply becoming a means of expression, just as all other arts have been before it, and in particular painting and the novel. After having been successively a fairground attraction, an amusement analogous to boulevard theatre, or a means of preserving the images of an era, it is gradually becoming a language. By language, I mean a form in which and by which an artist can express his thoughts, however abstract they may be, or translate his obsessions exactly as he does in the contemporary essay or novel. That is why I would like to call this new age of cinema the age of camera stylo, camera pen. And this metaphor has a very precise sense. By it, I mean that the cinema will gradually break free from the tyranny of what is visual, from the image for its own sake, from the immediate and concrete demands of the narrative, to become a means of writing just as flexible and subtle as written language. This art, although blessed with an enormous potential, is an easy prey to prejudice. It cannot go on forever ploughing the same field of realism and social fantasy which has been bequeathed to it by the popular novel. It can tackle any subject, any genre. The most philosophical meditations on human production, psychology, metaphysics, ideas, and passions lie well within its province. I will even go so far as to say that contemporary ideas and philosophies of life are such that only the cinema can do justice to them. And here he explicitly brings up the notion of adaptation when he says, "Let us now have a look at the way people make concessions to the supposed but fallacious requirements of the cinema. Scriptwriters who adapt Balzac or Dostoevsky excuse the idiotic transformations they impose on the works from which they construct their scenarios by pleading that the cinema is incapable of rendering every psychological or metaphysical overtone. The only cause of these compressions is laziness and lack of imagination. The cinema of today is capable of expressing any kind of reality. What interests us is the creation of this new language." This, of course, implies that the scriptwriter direct his own scripts, or rather that the scriptwriter ceases to exist. For in this kind of filmmaking, the distinction between author and director loses all meaning. Direction is no longer a means of illustrating or presenting a scene, but a true act of writing. The filmmaker writes with his camera just as the writer writes with his pen. And so we can see how this article by Alexandre Astruc, from 1948, by the way, does actually prefigure and predict a lot of the developments, the stylistic, formal developments that the French New Wave filmmakers would bring to the medium of cinema. And that sort of different approach, that different conception or understanding of film language, or what film language could possibly be. And this is something that author Robert Stam actually covers as well in his book François Truffaut and Friends, Modernism, Sexuality and Film Adaptation, where he writes that Truffaut and the New Wave made a number of innovations in terms of adaptation, especially in comparison with earlier French cinema. First of all, they adapted new kinds of novels, whereas the antecedent French tradition of quality preferred to adapt prestigious classical novels from the French realist tradition, Stendhal, Balzac, Zola. The New Wave directors favoured less canonical, often foreign and more contemporary writers, such as David Goodis, Ray Bradbury, and Henri-Pierre Rocher, who Truffaut was a big fan of. And in a separate essay called Adaptations and the French New Wave, a study in ambivalence, Robert Stam brings up the concept of automatic difference, which, as its name suggests, is the idea that even if you were literally just adapting something from the page to the screen, essentially one-to-one, there will always be an automatic difference between the two, simply because of how that text is embodied in a different medium, an audio-visual medium. And talking about Godard's contempt, Stam writes that Godard claimed, nevertheless, that his adaptation was both faithful to and different from its source. Quote, I kept the basic materials and transformed a few details on the principle that whatever is filmed is automatically different from what is written, and therefore original. And so this interest in using source material, novels, literature as a kind of material that can be then manipulated in the adaptation, in the film, we can obviously see how this becomes a kind of recurring motif in Godard's films specifically, where the original text is kind of cut off from its original author and creates a whole new set of associations within Godard's films, associations with what Godard invents for the film, the characters, the world, the story, but also with other texts. And we can see this kind of come to its natural conclusion in his film Nouvelle Vague, where all of the dialogue and all of the narration is made entirely from pre-existing quotes. And Godard was also famously averse to scripts. He would kind of have a plan for the film he wanted to make and would sort of improvise during production, which is something that his buddy Jacques Rivette also did in his films. Rivette had a very interesting and completely different approach to the notion of the screenplay or the scenario. So here's another interview with Rivette. This one is actually from Sight and Sound magazine, so that nicely brings us back to the beginning. And in this interview, he talks about how he puts together his films and the plots for his films. And he says, I hate to have the feeling, either during the shooting or the editing, that everything is fixed and nothing can be changed. I reject the word script entirely, at any rate in the usual sense. I prefer the old usage of the term scenario which it had in the Commedia dell'arte, meaning an outline or scheme. It implies a dynamism, a number of ideas and principles from which one can set out to find the best possible approach to the filming. So what Rivette would often do, and this is especially the case in Out One, which is in my view his masterpiece, is that he would basically come up with a kind of outline, or a scheme, as he puts it, a scenario, so a set of characters and possible plot directions and situations, and he would start each scene with that scheme, and then he would just kind of let the scene play out. He would let the actors do their thing, and they would sort of find the shape of the story as they went along. Now, obviously, whether it's Godard, or Truffaut, or Rivette, or René, or Duras, it's clear that the French New Wave brought to film a completely different, or at least popularized a completely different approach to understanding the literary dimension of cinema, its relation to pre-existing source material and its understanding of adaptation, of how to adapt pre-existing source material, as well as a new conception of how to write film, in contrast with how we write stories in different mediums, like the novel or theatre. So yeah, this discussion provides an interesting look at one of those fundamental problems of cinema, how it distinguishes itself from previous art forms, and perhaps why the tradition of quality is forgotten and considered mediocre is precisely because its filmmakers were limiting themselves, subordinating themselves to a text, to a literature, whereas the French New Wave filmmakers, while very well-read, very literary, made films that paid homage to those influences and incorporated them, but without subordinating the filmic image, the audiovisual art, to a text, to a literature that they would simply translate onto the screen. And maybe this kind of formal freedom and this freedom in the approach to intertextuality that the French New Wave experimented with ironically allowed them to be even more literary than the tradition of quality, which could only ever hope to be, at most, slightly worse than the source material, never surpassing it, never transcending it, just always being an inferior translation of it. So yeah, that was one way of understanding the emergence and significance and success of the French New Wave, and what made it stand out against the backdrop of the particular kind of French cinema that preceded it in the post-war years. And that's it. That's going to be all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not exactly sure what topic I'll be covering in the next episode, but I do have a bunch of interesting ideas lined up, so I hope I'll see you in the next one. Until then, I don't know, go watch some boring old movies that nobody cares about. It's more informative than you might think.